So again, I want to thank Chris and Hayon and Jeff for putting the series together. In preparation for this, I actually got to watch and re-engage with a lot of my favorite scholars in childhood art and play through the center, who I've admired for a really long time. So I'm actually really honored to be included in this series where important conversations are happening. I consider myself one of those adjacent people who's trying to think about play and drawing and writing and learning alongside everybody here. So, in preparation for this talk, it's given me the opportunity to look back on my research as an ethnographer of childhood culture, particularly in schools. I've been able to reflect on a lot of children's pieces, so it's been really delightful to kind of go back and recall the narrative delights, the creative invention, and serious social work of children as they make their proverbial mark in the world. I considered it a privilege to be invited into these K2 spaces. So before I start, I thought I would just talk a little bit about what my work has been so far. So for the last 10 years, I've engaged with young children's textual constructions anywhere from 4 months to 1 year, often working alongside teachers to curate and design pedagogical and curricular spaces of play, literacy, and inquiry. This work has brought me to inclusive classrooms serving children with autism, um, multilingual classrooms, and the duress of harsh language policies, both urban and small urban classrooms serving mostly children of color. So today I want to look back on these drawings from some of these young children to explore the following question. How can literacy, particularly drawing, be a form of play, identity, work, and expression? And how can drawing be utilitarian and practical while also creative and aesthetic? And so to explore this question, I traced the contours of children's physical marks on a page alongside the socio-relational contours embedded into children's text. So throughout the presentation, I'm probably going to use literacy, drawing, and writing interchangeably throughout. In our current landscape, there is so much debate about what counts as literacy, whether it's to read, whether it's to write, and communication is sometimes narrowed down into a set of linear skills that forefront print and alphabetic principles. So in an effort to get children more quote unquote literate, we tend to overlook and ignore the social, intellectual, and aesthetic moves of young children who are putting their mark literally out into the world. They're declaring friendships and power are sedimented onto children's texts. There are more than utilitarian and functional texts that we render them to be. They are struggles for, quote, power, to borrow from Angie's text here. So I wonder what would happen if we took a both and approach that acknowledges that children, quote unquote, got power. What if we return to the idea that literacy is about communicative competence, about drawing from multiple modal resources as forms of expression? We often use symbolic tools, even as adults, to create, to construct, and narrate the stories we want to tell, much like the children you'll be introduced to here. These drawings are evocative and have affective resonances, and the artist-writer chooses what multimodal forms articulate not just content, but also feelings, desires, and intentions. So this is true for all artists, not just young children. The colors, the shapes, the texture, the positioning, they all play equally important roles in expressing the affective resonance of a text. So I want to start with positioning children as contributors and active participants in the world. They are, as bell hooks recounts, cultural theorists, referring to a space located in her southern United States home. Bell hooks recounts stories of children coming over to admire paintings, to play, and to chat about and critique cultural life. She describes a small space in her house, complete with the red door, where children walked in and out as they often did in her community. She says, the door led into a room designed for small bodies, everything in reach, nothing placed to intimidate or threaten. Although I was unable to conjure clear memories, I tried to remember my relationship to space as a child. The ways that break with dependence on grown-ups or older, bigger siblings and the assertion of one's own agency was a declaration of freedom and power. I remember thinking, she writes, and like all cultural critics who are children, sharing my observation with the world around me. And if I had the power, I would make everything in the world be the right size for children, and grown-ups would have to learn how to do everything differently. Bell Hooks then offers a radical way of reimagining children's social worlds, a space where their age, their size, their dispositions, their culture are not relegated to the margins of everyday life, but are recentered and instructive for everyone else. So, of specific relevance and resonance today is the story she tells of two young Black girls analyzing a Jacob Lawrence painting, The Lovers, and their forthright observation. After spending so much time with bell hooks, one of them comments, "Hey, you have a thing for the color red." To which she replied, "Yes, I'm into red because it's revolutionary." And from there, the conversation around the painting ensues. The use of red as a color of seduction and desire, the way the lovers are positioned on the couch, the record player next to them, the darkness and depth of the color of their bodies juxtaposed against a very bright red table, the movement of their bodies, although while sitting down, they actually look like they could be dancing. And if you think about this conversation, it is pretty revolutionary. What bell hooks often referred to as some girlfriends, quote, sitting together practicing cultural criticism. And for me, this reveals an adult taking children's observations and their ideas pretty seriously. They too could be artists and cultural theorists who had something to say about their world. And so what bell hooks reminds us is that young people are drawing from their situated context, from available resources, and contributing to the social landscape. And while she illustrates young children commenting on art, today I want to talk about children actually making this art, not simply as something to be displayed or shown, but as a social, embodied, and relational text. Different from art displayed on walls and museums, and I would even say schools, children's art tells a larger story of relationality and becoming. It's easy to dismiss the musings and appropriations of children as developmental, as experimental, as maybe overly simplistic, yet even the simplest drawings and ideas constructed on a piece of paper can tell a deeper, more complicated story of becoming, being, and belonging. So I'm going to start here with Tyson's drawing. Tyson was a kindergartner. He enjoyed telling stories and socializing. One day you could say he was over socializing during writing time. He was at a table with a group of other children, Clavin, his frenemy, being one of them. They had a very sordid relationship through the year. Both boys were well liked. They were verbal, very sought after play partners. And the two of them were often at odds with each other, vying for attention or outdoing the other in cultural knowledge and classroom dominance. From where I stood as the researcher in the room, the same dynamic ensued today as any other day. They were both talking. Both of them were leading their classmates, quote, astray with their stories. And on this day, it just so happened that Tyson was the one that got into trouble and was moved to a table away from the others by himself. This is the drawing that he came up with at the end of the writing period. And they were working on letter writing, like writing letters to people. And as is the custom at the end of most of the writing times, the teacher asked them to find a partner to read their letter or their writing to. So Tyson, he immediately tries to find Clavin and exclaimed that he'd like to read his writing to him. So he sat across from him, showed him the picture, and quickly read, "Dear Clavin, you got swept up by a tornado." And if we look further into the drawing, we can see it, the helpless figure dangling from the sharp-toothed tornado. So it was clear to me that the intersection of playful moments, text, and literacy were complex and intricate, detailing the social life and energy of children's lives worth studying and analyzing. And as Hannah Dyer explains, in children's art and play, what is taken for granted is often broken down and reimagined. Children can tell a new story of relationality and subject formation. In art such as novels, film, and drawing, difficult realities are worked out. And for Tyson, this was his difficult reality. And the drawing was a documentation of how he navigated that reality, not as a temporal fleeting moment, but accumulated over time in his relationship with Clavin. So there are functional skills related to art that young children learn early on, using shapes for figures, grounding their figures, using drawing and letters together, labeling their drawings through symbols, matching words to text. This is understandable to adults. It's something we can identify and evaluate. And these paradigms also filter into how children distinguish who is a good artist and what is a good art. Sometimes good at something is synonymous to following the directions and following the rules. But what about those drawings that are not recognizable and confusing? It's what Christopher Schulte refers to as plot holes, or as sites of mutation and creation with the capacity to open us to new and particular working dimensions of how and why children draw as they do. So I want to show you another drawing by a 5-year-old named Joel. And his teacher walks up to Joel, Mrs. Green, and she says, Joel, I'd like to come here and see what you are doing. And Joel says, oh, this is a picture of me and Jack. Mrs. Green says, so you and Jack are in this? And she continues and says, you know what I noticed? And he says, what? And she says, I noticed that there's a lot of lines. What are all those lines? Joel hesitates for a moment and says, well, they're mountains. The mountains are breaking. And Mrs. Green says, okay, what's happening in the mountains? They're breaking. What else is going on? And he responds, I don't know. And she says, I see a lot of mountains. It kind of makes it hard for me to see you. And obviously she's going to say Jack. And he says, we're getting off the mountains. I'm running down. It's chaotic and unaesthetic at first glance. When questioned about his drawing, he improvised and articulated the layers of his drawings. And in fact, when you uncover all the mountains, you actually can see Jack and Joel. The day before, the mountains as scribbles were not part of the landscape. And as adults, we assumed that he ruined it with the scribbles and the shading. But for him, the drawing was a story. The lone figures from the day before were temporal. They represented friendships and belonging. However, the next day, they were moving in body and action. The lines and the scribbling represented that action, and the next day, these drawings would layer on another series of ideas and events. The same improvisation was also true for Trayvon. Sanjay looks over at Trayvon's paper and says, that's scribbles, that's scribbles. And Trayvon says, it's not scribbles. And Mrs. Green says, well, what is it? And Trayvon says, well, it's my pets. And Mrs. Green says, but would a pet look like that? And Trayvon says, it's a different snake pet. And like Joel, he uses a story to improvise, to create, and to make sense of the marks on his page for himself and others. Each time he added layers and shading to the story to mark out an intention for that particular day, which was different from the day before. And when the story changes, the marks on the paper represent multiple times, planes, and spaces. They are plot holes that do not follow a linear logical pathway. The drawings get restored with every new encounter, and with each new encounter, vestiges of a time before and a time after remain. Or let's look at Julie. She takes a different approach to explaining her scribbles. She says to her friend John, guess what? I'm making more lines, and so you'll see more lines at the bottom. John, so I can write more things down. I'm writing more words as I go along and writing more. And John says, you're not writing words. And Julie says, I'm doing it. I'm doing cursive writing. And John says, oh. And Julie says, I'm doing it in cursive. Cursive is not usual writing. It looks like gibberish, but it is. I actually know how to do my name in it. It's kind of sunny. I'm doing my name in gibberish, and I'm that kind of writing. And I love this approximation of cursive writing, the emphasis on the squiggles, curves, continuous connected lines. She identifies that it's not usual writing, that it's actually unusual. And in the same way as Joel and Trayvon, the cursive writing allows her to make meaning, to tell a story, to express ideas. In Deborah Freeman's book, Scribble, Emma makes fun of her younger sister, Lucy, as she draws her scribble kitty, claiming that her drawing was just a set of, quote, scribbles. And in this case, scribbling was a gesture towards unrecognizable, unserious, and unaesthetic. But marking a page, experimenting with lines, exploring placement is one of our first artistic experiences when young children discover that ideas take shape, as Linda Berry would say. And as soon as they put pen to paper, so to speak, they are potentially met with criticism and critique. accused of scribbling. And across all these examples, children actually take these accusations pretty personally because art is just that. It is personal and an extension of one's identity. The scribbles are meaningful renderings of friendships formed and also friendships fractured. They are children's experimentations with the world around them. They are the remnants of children's social lives. And so, of course, they're going to take these critiques personally because it is larger than the markings on the paper. As Lucy retorts in the book, they are alive and attached to our identities and stories. So the book is an example of how these dismissals don't just happen between adults and children, but amongst their peers. Another illustration is this. The children in a kindergarten classroom are writing P's. The teacher says to first draw a circle and then a tail. It's simple instructions, but says a lot about how writing is often facilitated as a drawing exercise. While teachers guide children into the act of writing, children also evaluate and read each other's work. Jo looked at Tanea's attempt and points out that the placement of her P's is incorrect. You know what you're doing? You know what you're doing? You're writing scribble scrabble. Tanea, thoroughly annoyed by his unsolicited comment, retorts, okay, well, just don't look at it, and covers the whole paper with her head in her arms. He continues writing scribble scrabble, writing scribble scrab, and it doesn't stop there. He continues to evaluate her drawing multiple times throughout the beginning of the school year. He examines her drawing one time and says, you made a mess. What are you writing, Tanea? Oh, nothing? Hey, I made you a turtle. And he continues to draw a turtle on her paper. His turtle was stamped onto Tanea's drawing, which I think is actually far from a mess. Different from Joel or Trayvon or Lucy's drawing, Tanea's drawing has a lot of details. If you look at the eyelids, the hair, the differentiated facial expressions, the teeth, the height, the capes, aside from the out-of-place turtle that Jo put in, there's a coherence and voice to her drawings. It's distinct, and like most artists strive to do, she has a voice and point of view. If you saw these three figures separately, you would immediately recognize Tanea's stamp. Just like when I see these turtles, I would also recognize Jo's stamp. They are both developing their voice as artists and storytellers. However, one feels dominance and power over the other because Jo has mastered school logics, while Tanea is developing an aesthetic. They are both important. They have skills and functions, but they also have to form individual perspectives. And this implicit attention to perhaps over standardizing and following the logics of drawing takes away some of their voice, much like how it happens when children write formulaic stories. So children's unique drawings remind us that there is a utilitarian function of art techniques alongside a point of view. And unfortunately, functional logics of drawing took over the aesthetic vision even for Tanea. By December, if you can see, Tanea would also learn to conform and get schooled, relying on shapes, gendered hairstyles and clothing, common facial features, and less details that distinguish one figure from another. So I share these texts to surface the drawings of young children as more than just scribbles. Scribbling connotes a haphazard placement of marks on page, but further exploration reveals the intentional moves of children as they draw on the page. And at times, these ideas reveal sophisticated improvisations of storytelling. Other times, they document relational entanglements, attachments, tensions, and fissures that provide narrative fragments and threads. And as Aunt Dyson writes, threads knit together and dangle off narrative lines. There's always a danger of making linear plot lines where there are complex contingencies and influential happenings in surprisingly related horizontal practice. And so scribbling is one form of children's artful rendering. But what happens when ideas take shape, as Linda Berry articulates? This next drawing is drawn by a kindergartner, Jalen. He was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fan. There was such precision and accuracy placed into how he drew the Ninja Turtles. And if you know, the color choices of the masks are really important, as you can see here, and the facial expressions connote degrees of seriousness. Nicknames are modern-day adaptations, but also connote familiarity with the media ecology. On Valentine's Day, he eagerly showed the class his Ninja Turtle Valentines, which many of his classmates already predicted he would bring. Like many of the young children documented by Ann Dyson, the popular culture of text were encoded as textual productions in Jalen's literacy learning, as well as his identity in the social landscape. His deep participation in Turtles was exemplified in his choice of Valentine's cards, his selection of Halloween costumes, his choice of play scenarios, and what he chose to perfect in his drawings and in his stories, which often included remixed stories involving the turtles. For Jalen, Turtles offered him a way to be known and recognized by others in the classroom community. He directed others' play where Turtles served as a plot line. He corrected others and their knowledge of Ninja when their knowledge of Ninja Turtles fell short. He insisted that turtles only fight the bad guys. They only fight foot soldiers. And even when another student just wanted to pretend that the turtles were still bad guys, he said, no, they only fight the shredder. They only fight the shredder. So Jalen, through his drawing, asserted himself as expert, embodied in his participation in play, bolstered by his textual production, situating himself as a reader, writer, and person, committed to preserving the legacy of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, alongside his ability to use literacy to create identity text, which helped him access power and social capital. Many children were interested in similar media materials, but few were able to bring it to life in their drawings, winning the admiration of both children and teachers. So for Jalen, his drawing was an identity text. I'm going to share with you now and with the story of Lucas, and do a little bit of a deeper dive into his text, because his text was not only about identity, it was also embodied and also playful. So I want to spend the last part of this talk focusing on Lucas and the TIE fighters, twin ion engines. Lucas was a neurodivergent autistic child. He was curious, inquisitive, and empathetic. He was someone that often invited me to play. And on this day, when he called me over to his seat, I knew and braced myself for something that had to do with the Star Wars universe. He had already started drawing a bunch of TIE fighters, if you see them on the paper, before I got there. He fluidly moved into the story right away, which included a bunch of TIE fighters protected by a shield and a lone TIE fighter who was working alone. And he asked me, you know how we'll get them? And he says, shoot them. And he jumps out of his seat and puts his hand up, but from the inside. But how will we shoot from the inside if there are loads of TIE fighters in there? And I say, well, yeah, how do you shoot through the shield? And he says, TIE fighters can shoot through shields. Nobody can shoot into the shield. They can shoot out of the shield. But if they shoot that TIE fighter, the shield is destroyed. So as you can tell, I am thoroughly confused at this point. But he continues and says, so, you know what I want to get? I want to get some crayons. And then he changes his mind and says, actually, I think colored pencils are better. And then he tells me, but look, these are the bad guys, okay? So he clarifies that the bunch of TIE fighters that are drawn in that picture are the bad guys. And he says, this is the good TIE fighter, the one that's alone. And he also has a shield. Look, he has a shield. But look, it didn't shoot through. It just hit the shield. And I say, okay. But he says, but look, another TIE fighter is shooting at it, but it still hit the shield. Look, it still hits the shield. And then I ask, well, is it reflecting? And then he says, another one shoots. Look, it's reflecting, right? Mm-hmm. And then he says, and they're not getting through. And I repeat, and they are not getting through. But Lucas says, but he has an idea. He shoots through and presses into his drawing. But look, he hit it. Now they are having a bit of a battle. What I will say is that within those 3 hours, I think, of my time in that classroom that morning, I spent a good amount of time with him, entering his own Star Wars universe through his drawings. And although intermittently there were other things going on, he managed to draw me back in over and over again. I listened. I asked him questions about Darth Vader and stormtroopers. I inquired about the new generation of Star Wars characters. I engaged with him, and in the process, and perhaps motivated by my curiosity, he produced for me a lot of artifacts and a lot of drawing artifacts for me to mediate my participation and to increase my knowledge. He told me about Anakin's bloody face, which meant that the new movie was actually too scary for him. He told me about General Grievous's lightsabers. He says, "That's his neck. Isn't it so funny?" Which I respond, I guess. And later I would come to realize that the color of your lightsaber has everything to do with your identity and powers. He made stormtroopers across generations, pointing out differences between them. He made me an instructional sheet where he articulated who and what is included in this galaxy, people and things I should know. He actually motivated me to want to learn more. And as the morning was coming to a close, he asked me, "Excuse me, can you come to recess?" Meaning, after all this time, he wasn't done. We had an intense connection that day, mobilized by what is on his paper. I spent all my time with him, certainly ineffective in research terms. I wasn't quite sure if anything would happen with all of these drawings made on old school dot matrix printer paper, but it was delightful. There were no parameters or limitations to our time together. The drawing was an embodied, playful experience for both of us. But what I experienced then, and what I hope you felt in the same way, was the aesthetic experience of literacy and drawing, the ability for literate acts to move us and play as a way to mobilize and motivate us towards these acts. Lucas demonstrates that literacy is embodied, that what is on a piece of paper has reverberations and resonances that live outside of it. Lalitha Vasudevan describes multimodal play as calling attention to the spontaneous, unscripted, undirected, and often unpredictable interactions young people have with modal resources and materials. And in this case, drawing and play fostered a multimodal experience that demonstrated identity, knowledge, participation, and contribution. And I think the same thing about writing, or in this case, drawing. Referring back to bell hooks, she talks about how writing, and can easily put in their drawing, is my passion. It is a way to experience the aesthetic. Seduced by the magic of written and spoken words in childhood, I am still transported, carried away by performing the words to both hear and feel them. I want to be certain I'm grappling with language in a manner where my words live and breathe, where they surface from a passionate place inside me. And I couldn't help but think about Lucas when I read this. He was ecstatic, he was performing, he was embodying writing, and that language was taking him to a different place. Lucas's mother writes similarly about Lucas, as she says, he is feverishly drawing with markers, hashing out elaborate play schemes. These drawing sessions are not like the quiet time I had with my crayons as a kid. The movements of competing starships are shown in detail. There are explanations, there are sound effects, exciting parts of the story. He walks his fingers into the heart of the battle, and his body reverberates when the Death Star's explosion rattles the galaxy. And so for me, that is passion, that is ecstasy, that is magic. It is the very definition of what it means to be carried away by drawing, where language and words live and breathe from a passionate place. It is aesthetic. And so much like an artistic practice, it is technical, embodied, material, creative, relational, and experiential. And that's how seriously we might want to take the marks that children make on the page. So I'm going to share one more drawing from Lucas. And this was early on before he even entered school. This is a drawing that hangs in the living room of his family home. The large figure on the chair is his late grandfather, known to Lucas as Pop Pop. In the little chair is Lucas. His Pop Pop and him are exchanging X-Wing fighters aboard a Star Destroyer. I'm not going to explain all the Star Wars terminology in there, but that is all from Star Wars. Lucas didn't actually know his Pop Pop very well, according to his mother. Most of his memories of his grandfather were from photographs. And in the distance, the stick figure that you see all the way in the corner is actually his mother. Lucas drew this picture after asking his mother about his grandfather, given that Pop Pop had recently passed away. He was curious where Pop Pop actually went. And while his mother fumbled through an answer, Lucas crafted this picture of the three of them in hyperspace. And while many of Lucas's drawings hung in the hallway, he insisted that this drawing get hung in the living room next to his toys. So, what do we learn from this? To answer this question, I put forth the idea that children are already literate beings, that by engaging in a digital world where words juxtaposed alongside images are moving, are embodied, and very meaningful. It is part of the television shows they watch, as we've seen from Jalen. It's part of the media they engage with, the stories they tell each other, and the material artifacts surrounding their childhoods. It is also part of their community and their social and cultural spaces. Therefore, the nexus of children's play and drawing are naturally where many children enter into formal literacy of reading, of writing, drawing, and a myriad of communicative forms. And I shared this drawing of Lucas's grandfather and him there because he was also drawing this picture for his mother, who he knew was sad and kind of broken up by the death of her own father. It was a way to draw her in, to empathize, and to bring her into community. And I see that same resonance with him when I was in the classroom, trying to figure my way in, trying to make connections with the children in the classroom as both a researcher and a new adult in there. And there were many times that he used drawings to bring me into this space, to help me move from being an outsider and someone who was in the margins to someone who was central and part of the classroom community. So for many years, I have researched young children at play. And without fail, I'm always struck by how much energy and effort it goes into truly understanding children's play. So one minute you are a princess having a wedding, and the next minute you might be SpongeBob flying into space. And both, all, and none of these characters end up on children's drawings. I think about how many times I've witnessed children tell these elaborate stories, and what remains on the drawing is only a vestige of the stories that they tell. But what remains on the page is actually a different kind of telling and a different kind of story that is also worth noticing and analyzing. Or in their play, there's a Star Wars-like rebellion can last anywhere from 2 minutes to 2 hours. And like Lucas, some children can use their drawings to invite, engage, and play with a seriousness and passion. Therefore, drawings can mobilize children's play. Children can happily build a detailed and intricate Lego town and later destroy that same town due to an explosive argument you knew nothing about. So I harken back to Joel's piece where it was neat and tidy the day before with two figures, and later on, there was a lot layered on top of it that mobilized by emotions and the happenings of that day. So sometimes these tensions also surface on children's drawings. A seemingly haphazard string of random scribbles reveals the social life and dynamics of children's community. They make sense of these resources as remixed and restored characters in their drawings. A group of children might aimlessly and repetitively push marbles from one point to another, finding endless delight in a seemingly simple act in their play. And these repetitive markings are also salient in many children's drawings, which I hope you notice throughout the talk. My point is that play and the subsequent drawings children are making are many things. They take on many forms. They are unpredictable. They are wildly complex. And what I've learned from children is that this play, drawing, and their markings are worth understanding fully. Thank you.